Howdy folks, welcome back to the last week of research methods. This is Dr. Gabriel Sines, and today we'll be talking about advanced topics. Now, when I set the schedule for this course, I originally anticipated not covering everything, and I figured we'd be talking about some of the more complicated aspects of research design here at the end. However, we've actually done pretty dang well. We've covered as much as I really intended to. So this last section is actually going to be comprised of two miscellaneous topics. First, we'll talk about research involving animals, why it's useful, what problems might be involved, and then we'll take a look at some of the positives and negatives of how our current research publication system actually works. We'll also take a brief look at how to put together your final paper and what things to watch out for there. So let's get started. Research involving animals in psychology is often called comparative models or comparative modeling because we're trying to understand people by comparing them to animals. So we're going to talk about what animal research looks like, what different nuances there are for animal research, and we'll also take a moment to talk about using computers as models for people as well. So just to get a couple terms squared away, animal research is research involving animals. Comparative research is what psychologists call doing research on animals with the purpose of understanding people. We'll look at an example of that here in a second, but there's a lot of research that gets done on animals with the purpose of understanding how things affect people. For example, you hear about lab mice being used as testers for medication, for cancer treatments, for so many different things in medicine. And that same kind of stuff translates over to psychology, where we use animals for various different reasons to understand people. Now, this is very different from animal psychology. Animal psychology is trying to understand animals' minds and their behavior. So there are psychological researchers whose purpose is just to understand animals, not necessarily to understand animals so we can understand people. Let's get started on just a simple example of what comparative psychology actually does. So there's a huge world of comparative psychology. It's as wide as research can be because we try to use as much information that we can gather from animals to understand people. There's a drive now to understand how animals work and how Mother Nature builds things and comes up with solutions to problems that we can have as well, so that we can translate those solutions. In comparative psychology, we really try to understand animals and say that those understandings will work for people. A The example I always think of for comparative psychology involves sea slugs. It's an example that I got started with when I was learning a bit about neuroscience. So the reason that scientists like to work with sea slugs is that they are very simple animals. They have brains or brain-like structures comprised of neurons and nerves, and those nerves have circuits just like they do in people. The thing about the sea slug circuits is that the neurons are huge. They are, compared to our nerve cells, gigantic, and so they're very easy to look at and work with. Beyond that, they're very simple. There's not that many complicated thoughts going on in sea slugs. So what happens? Sea slugs like to eat, and they need to find food to eat, so they have to learn what food is good to eat. In this example of research involving sea slugs, scientists gave a sea slug seaweed, and seaweed that was wrapped in plastic, with the idea being that over time the sea slug would learn that the plastic wrapped seaweed was not good to eat. So here we have, before the sea slug has learned, you give them the plastic wrapped seaweed, and it's not able to digest it, or it has more trouble digesting it or breaking it apart. That information is available through the sensory neurons, the part of its body that says, oh, this is tough, I can't chew this, or I can't transform this into an easily consumable material. That then tells the motor neurons to spit the food out or to avoid it or ignore it uh, if it's not edible, or if it is edible, if it can be swallowed, go ahead and eat it so you don't you don't go hungry. Over time, giving a sea slug the plastic wrapped seaweed will make it learn that that feeling of plastic is not something it should be taking in. So over time, it'll go, I can't eat this, I'll spit it out. But eventually, it'll just be able to tell, I'm not interested in this plastic because it's so hard to eat, and it won't even try to eat it. Now, that seems like a very simple bit of learning, and in people it might be very complicated, but in the sea slug it's really not. In the sea slug, you have the learning that happens, well, try to eat the food, you feel the food, then you decide what to do with it, one of those two things. In the sea slug, what might happen is over time, the tough food goes to the sensory neurons, and that would just go directly to rejecting the food. So we could skip this thinking phase that might happen in this little arrow here, and so that over time, the sea slug will learn to always reject that tough plastic. Not even going to try and eat it, it's wasting its time, it'll go look for food somewhere else. And the wonderful thing about that is not only can we observe the sea slug learning that, but you can actually dissect the sea slug and visually observe the neurons as they are growing and making those connections. Plus, sea slugs are not going to be too badly ruined if you open them up a little bit because they're pretty hardy creatures. So there's an example of comparative psychology. By working with the sea slug and the sea slug's neurons and teaching the sea slug information, we can observe and learn how neurons create new connections. We can learn how neurons learn things, and we can make assumptions about how our brain's neurons work based off of how the sea slug's neurons work. Okay, so animal psychology, that being research into understanding animals' thoughts and behaviors, is a totally different branch, but very related to comparative psychology. Now, the purposes for animal psychology are going to be different. If in comparative psychology we're trying to understand people, in animal psychology, understanding the animals may help us benefit. When I think of animal psychology, I always think of Temple Grandin, a lady who is famous for a lot of different reasons, successful for a lot of different reasons, but one of the things she's most successful for was her designing of revolutionary systems for handling cattle. So before Temple came on the scene, a lot of our cattle pens were square, with 90-degree angle edges, just because it works for us and it makes sense to us to have those kind of square systems. But the thing is, she was able to understand that cattle don't like those hard angle edges, and instead what they prefer is a rounded edge. So if they're going to be moving around an area, they would prefer to move in a circle for lots of different reasons. And if you want to learn more about that, I've got extras information here at the end of the PowerPoint. This is number 2, and a little bit more about comparative psychology if you want learning about that, number 1, at the extras at the end of the PowerPoint. But the point is that thanks to these rounded designs, the amount of cattle that were hurt drastically reduced, and people are able to make a lot better profit and have much better living conditions for the cattle, even if they were for meat. And that drastically improved the industry. And so now everyone uses these rounded pen systems that will help the cattle get along without hurting themselves, crowding each other into corners, or having to fight them to get them where you need them to go. So there's a wonderful example of animal psychology. I want to talk just briefly about behaviorism and B.F. Skinner. Behaviorism is the idea that in psychology, the only thing that we should pay attention to are the behaviors we can observe. So the things that happen in your mind, the things that we can't visually see, are not things that we should be researching or trying to understand, because that leads to making stuff up, or it leads to finding things that aren't actually there. B.F. Skinner was a man who's very famous for this type of research. He's famous for Skinner boxes, contraptions used to study mice and how they learned about things. And one of his conclusions from behaviorism was the idea that everyone's thoughts work in one way or another like a slot machine. That might sound crazy, but let me put it to you this way. So let's say that you feed a mouse some food or a treat every time it pushes a lever. It's going to learn very, very quickly that pushing the lever means treats. And so it's going to pick up the behavior of pushing the lever very quickly. But if you stop rewarding the mouse for pushing that lever, it's going to stop pushing the lever very quickly. It's going to give up because it expected a reward every single time. B.F. Skinner found that if you reward the mouse only sometimes, randomly, the mice will take longer to learn to push the lever, but the learning takes longer to disappear, because it's almost like gambling. If you sometimes win, sometimes lose, you have the incentive to keep playing even if you don't get rewarded. This idea is something that Skinner expanded to everything and everywhere. So he would say that people have learning in their minds through just a very long, complicated series of reward systems that are kind of like slot machines. So anything that works for you, that you're rewarded for, you're going to do it more often. If you're only sometimes rewarded for it, you're going to do it even when it's not always going to reward you. Like the idea that if you want to train your dog to not bark, you have to avoid giving them attention when they bark. And if you sometimes give attention, or if you give them attention only after they've barked a couple of times but before they've stopped, that's going to teach them to bark even more. So you have to be very, very careful about what you are teaching your dog and what you're teaching yourself due to this behaviorism. Now, there are issues with this. Of course, animals aren't exactly the same as people. There's lots of good and bad reasons why comparative psychology should or shouldn't be done. For example, of course, there are similarities in animals and people. We have neurons, and so do animals, and evolutionarily, we came from the same stock, so there are a lot of things that are very similar about people and animals. Another nice thing about doing research with animals is that there are many ethical issues that are sidestepped. And I'm not just talking about being able to do cancer research on rats, because they might die. But say, for example, you want to learn about what happens when a rat is only ever taught using rewards instead of punishments. And so the you take a baby rat from even before it's born and only ever work with rewards instead of punishments, or only ever let it live in a blue house or something like that. In people, it's not really feasible to be in total control of someone's life, but you can be in total control of an animal's life, and so it can be easier to work with the animal and come up with experiments that would give you interesting results, or that help you answer difficult questions. Of course, there are some problems with animal research, namely that animals are not people. We are not the same, and so conclusions from animal research are not always going to be viable for people. There is research that has been done on cockroaches that researchers assume works for people. The research behind baby Einstein, the idea that children can listen to Mozart and become smarter if they hear Mozart when they're babies, that actually comes from research done on rats. Who says that the way rats learn as infants works the same as how people learn as infants? There's other problems with the Baby Einstein brand, but it makes sense. If dogs focus in their lives on their senses of smell and hearing, and we focus on our lives on our sense of sight, the way a dog thinks is going to be totally different from the way a person thinks. And so research done on dogs might be useful, but it might not. Of course, there's also ethics involved in the research of animals. In people, you can ask, hey, would you like to participate? Would you like to leave? Is it okay to participate in return for a reward. But animals don't have those kind of choices, and they don't have the mind to be able to contemplate those choices. So you're going to run into ethical issues there. Okay, last thing, let's talk very briefly about computers as models. You will very often hear people talk about people's brains as a computer chip or excuse me. You'll often hear people talking about people's brains as computer chips or as hard drives, camera recorders. There is a long-standing history of people trying to understand people based off of the science of today. Computers are the modern science, and so we think about people as computers and think about minds as computers. But historically, we've tried to understand people with science of the day. Back in the day, we thought about people in terms of humors, their medical and physiological statuses being dictated by fluids in their body when we were just starting to understand fluid dynamics and chemistry. When we thought about people as being influenced by spirits and ghosts and demons, when the thoughts of the day were more spiritual in nature. And so, same thing kind of happens now. Now, I'm not trying to say that we shouldn't think about people as computers. There's a lot of benefits to thinking about neurons as working like circuits. And in fact, a lot of computer systems and research has been developed based off of how people work as well. But you want to be careful to assume that there are perfect one-to-one comparisons. In the activities for today, you'll have options to choose certain enrichments things where you can learn about one or more of the topics that we've talked about in this section. If you'd like, feel free to check out the topic, the podcast associated with people using computers as models to understand people. I hope this stuff is interesting, and I'll see you here in the next bit.